callers and are not necessarily those of KKNW, its management, or other advertisers. This program is sponsored by Sue Lundquist.
And stay tuned. Coming up next is an encore presentation of the Gratitude Café show with Sue Lundquist. Sue is unfortunately out of the studio today, but that's okay because we're going to bring to you some amazing information about your soul. Your dynamic host and founder, Sue Lundquist, will bring you her own intuitive talents and gifts for co-creating, healing, and teaching. Her show, The Gratitude Café, positive radio to feed your soul, is focused on bringing you to a higher place each week where you can leave the hustle of life at the door. So pull up a chair and join us for The Gratitude Café, positive radio to feed your soul. It actually is a special show today. Sue, unfortunately, is out of the studio, but in place of that, we're actually going to be bringing you some Dr. Joe Dispenza educational material that was gifted by him and his people, and it gives a sneak peek on what he and his methods are all about. It's about creating your future, thinking greater than your environment. Also, your personality creates your personal reality, and you're not doomed by genetics. A wonderful story even about overcoming cancer, and of course, 2 states of mind survival and creation, and how you can change. So, of course, this is a huge opportunity and a gift from Dr. Joe Dispenza. So sit back and enjoy your life for the next hour. Relax, get out maybe a pen or paper, because, of course, you want to take copious notes. So this is going to be a great educational show. And without further ado, I'd like to bring on Dr. Joe Dispenza.
I want you to turn to the person next to you. I want you to look him in the eye and introduce yourself as a genius. Let's begin. Now, geniuses, I have a few questions for you before we begin. Some effect on your life. That your thoughts create your life. You believe that, yes? The biggest reason why people don't do it is because you don't really believe it's true. You see, if you knew on a gut level that it was absolutely true, would you ever miss a day? Come on. And would you ever let any thought slip by your awareness that you didn't want to experience? So your brain, according to neuroscience, is organized to reflect everything you know in your life. Your brain is a record of your environment. It's a record, an artifact of your past. So if you believe this, then does your environment control your thinking, or does your thinking control your environment? So if you wake up in the morning and you get out of bed on the same exact side as you did the day before, you shut the alarm clock off with the same finger, you slip into your favorite slippers, you shuffle into the bathroom and you use the toilet like you always do, then you walk over to the mirror and you look at yourself to remember who you are, then you get into the shower and you wash yourself in the same routine way, then you groom yourself to look like everybody expects you to look. Then you go downstairs and you drink coffee out of your favorite mug. Then you drive to work the same way as you did the day before. You see the same people that push the same emotional buttons. You do the exact thing that you know how to do and you memorize and can do so well that you're an expert at. Then you hurry up and rush home, change it all that day. We could say that you are thinking the same thoughts, performing the same actions. As the environment turns on different circuits in your brain, you begin to think equal to your environment and to think equal to everything that you know. And as long as you think equal to everything that's familiar or known to you, what do you keep creating more of? Same life. Now, the quantum law is still applying to you. You're just thinking equal. Neuroscience says it's absolutely possible. And can you fall in love with the future potential, by the way, that already exists in the quantum field? And how many potentials exist in the quantum field? Infinite potentials. Can you pick a potential that already exists in the quantum field and fall in love with that future potential before the experience is made manifest? And begin to emotionally condition your body into believing that future event has already. Now, if your brain and body are physically changed that you least expect. Now, why does it have to come in a way that you least expect? Come on, geniuses. Because if you can expect it, it's nothing new. It's more of the same. It's got to come in a way that you would never anticipate, that rocks your world, that leaves no doubt that what you did inside of you produced some result outside of you. And when you can begin to see the results of your efforts, level, you would have to change the thoughts that you are thinking, the behaviors and habits that you're demonstrating, and the emotions that you've memorized that's become part of your identity. And most people try to create a new personal reality as the same personality, and it never works. We have to become somebody else. So then, as you keep thinking the same thoughts, performing the same actions, and living by the same experiences that produce the same emotions, there's a principle in neuroscience that says nerve cells that fire together wire together. And if you keep repeating the same states of mind and body over and over again, your brain begins to fire in the same sequences. In the same time you learn something new, you make a new connection in your brain. That begins to live by the same programs over time. The quantum law of reality says that your environment, your outer world, is an extension of your mind. So as you keep reproducing the same level of mind, you as the quantum observer are observing your life from the same level of mind. And as long as you observe from the same level of mind, your reality will keep showing up the same way. How many people understand? So now, every time you have a thought, you make a chemical. And if you have a great thought, or an unlimited thought, or a joyful thought, you turn on a set of circuits in your brain, begin to feel exactly the way you were just thinking. Great, or unlimited, or joyful. Now, if you have a negative thought, or an unhappy thought, or a self-depreciating thought, you turn on a different set of circuits, and a different combination, a different sequence, and a different pattern that produces a different level of mind. And the brain then begins to make a different batch of chemicals that signals the body for you to begin to feel exactly the way you were just thinking, negative or unhappy or unworthy. So the moment you begin to feel the way you think, because the brain is in constant communication with your body, you begin to think the way you feel, which makes more chemicals for you to feel the way you think, and then you think the way you feel, and then you feel the way you think, and then you think the way you feel. And some people do this for 20 or 30 or 40 years. Now, the redundancy of that cycle over time creates what I call a state of being. And a state of being is when your mind and body are working together, or your thoughts and feelings are aligned to a concept. So thought to memorize that emotion as well as the conscious mind. And whenever the body knows as well as the mind, that's called a habit. A habit is when your body is the mind. Now, 95% of who you are by the time you're 35 years old is a set of memorized behaviors, set of emotional reactions, beliefs, perceptions, attitudes that run just like a computer program. So 5% of your conscious mind begins to work against 95% of what you've memorized. So the person wants to think positively, but they're feeling negatively. They want to create their dream board, and put up their future life, but they feel unworthy. That's mind and body in opposition. We have to recondition the body to a new mind. So if 95% of who you are by the time you're 30, well, you'd have to be over 35 for this one, but couldn't consciously remember a phone number. And you practiced it so many times that your body knew better than your brain. So 95% of who you are is a set of those programs in which the body knows better than the mind, or the body becomes the mind. So would you agree then, if you have an insecure thought, you're going to feel insecure? Say, I am insecure. So how does this happen? Feelings and emotions are the end product of past experiences. When you graduated from college, you can remember the birth of a horse that you have. You can remember catching a fish off the coast of Mexico. You can remember going home and cooking it for dinner. You can remember drinking that really great Cabernet with the fish and ocean breeze hitting you in the face and the smell of the salt air. But you can't remember what you had for dinner the night before. It's because routine lulls the brain to sleep. Now, when you're in the midst of an experience, and as you're beginning to gather all of this vital sensory information from the environment, all of that data begins to rush back to your brain. And as that information goes back to your brain through those 5 sensory pathways, jungles of neurons begin to organize themselves into patterns to reflect the external event. So if feelings and emotions are the end product of past experiences, and you're caught in this cycle of thinking and feeling to the point where feelings become the means of thinking, or you can't think greater than how you feel, and you told me that your thoughts have something to do with your destiny. If you're thinking equal to how you're feeling, and feelings are a record of the past, are you thinking in the future creates an emotion, and an emotion that you fabricate by thought alone. So the person who's caught in the cycle of thinking and feeling and feeling and thinking, and they're thinking in their past, their body as their unconscious mind is beginning to believe it's in the same experience 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. To the body, it's living in the past. And we cannot go to a new future or create something new in our own thing. There's a chemical change in your body. And the moment you notice, that event in and of itself is called a memory. So you react to something in your life, and there's chemical changes in your body. There's a refractory period of chemicals that's running through your bloodstream. And if you don't know how to control your emotional reaction, and you allow that emotion to linger for hours or days, you know what that's called? That's called a mood. What's wrong with you? Oh, I'm in a mood. Why are you in a mood? Now, if you allow that emotional reaction to continue, so angry. Well, this thing happened to me 9 months ago, and I'm memorizing my emotional reaction. Now, if we keep that same refractory period that's connected to a past, they begin to wear as their personality. And so would you agree then that if you wanted to change your personality, you would have to begin to look at those emotions that have branded you, that keep you connected to the past? How many people are still with me? Now, a memory without the emotional charge is called wisdom, and that's the name of the game. So then, here's a young woman. She's dedicated to her family. She's raising her kids, and she's having a great life, living the dream. And all of a sudden, her husband comes home and says, "Listen, I'm moving to Buenos Aires with my 2 secretaries." Now, the woman goes through the normal emotional reactions. She feels anger, she feels resentment, she feels jealousy, she feels envy, she feels victimization. And what she doesn't know is that every time she recalls that event in her brain, she's producing the same chemistry in the brain and the body as if the event was happening. And as she continues to do it, she keeps teaching her body to live in the past. And her body begins to believe that she's in the same experience over and over again. And as those emotions begin to run, keeps it going for years, and it turns into a personality trait. And she does this for 20 years. And you come up to her 20 years later and you say, "Why are you this way? Why 20 years ago?" Which really means I'm stuck to my past and I haven't changed in the last 20 years. Would you agree? And I was altered from that event, and I'm moving to the south of France with my 2 secretaries and the mailman. And she goes through the same emotional reaction as the other lady. But all of a sudden, she realizes that living by this emotion isn't loving to her. And if she really loved her ex-husband, truly loved him, she would set him free. So she begins to read books about unconditional love, and she begins to fire and wire new circuits in her brain. She begins to establish networks of neurons to reflect this new mind. She contemplates on it and thinks about it, reinforces the circuits, and then she begins to apply what she learns. And she raises those children by herself. She takes them to all their competitive events and ballet. She goes to school in the evenings. She goes to work during the day. She graduates from college. She gets a new job at a successful company. 2 years later, she falls in love with the senior vice president. He travels the world and he takes her with her. 3 years later, they buy a home in the south of France, close to her ex-husband. Then her children graduate college and they get married and she has grandchildren. And you approach her 20 years later and you say to her, well, didn't your husband leave you 20 years ago? What do you think she's going to say? That was the best thing that ever happened to me. What's the difference? You see, one person was defined by the experience and she could never overcome the emotion. That became her identity. The other person transmuted the emotion into something else, and she began to change because of it. See, we are defined by our adversity. Imagine a person who's living in a state of suffering like that first woman for 20 years, thinking and feeling in the same cycle. Those feelings, she can't think greater than how she feels. She's thinking in the past. She's signaling the same gene over and over again by the same emotion, keeping the same gene turned on. And all of a sudden, she decides to change after 20 years of this. Now remember, the body has become the mind. The servant is now the master. And so all of a sudden, she shows up back up on the scene and she says, today, no more complaining, no more blaming, no more making excuses, no more talking about anybody else, no more self-pity. I'm just going to stop today. What do you think the body's going to say? Where you been? I've been doing this for the last 20 years. You've programmed me to be this way. I've even modified my receptor. Because now she's beginning to break that chemical continuity because she's not thinking the same way, she's not acting the same way, she's not feeling the same way. And that breaking that chemical cycle is so unfamiliar. And you can't predict the next feeling when you're outside the box. So then all of a sudden, as she begins to no longer signal the same emotional genes in the same way, the body begins to send information back up through the spinal cord, right up to the thinking brain. I call that the fast track. Now at the same time, chemical levels of suffering are dropping because she's no longer thinking and feeling in the same cycle. And there's a thermostat in your brain called the hypothalamus. And that hypothalamus all of a sudden begins to sense chemical levels of suffering are going down. And it sends a signal to the thinking brain. That's called the slow track. And the next thing you know, she starts to hear these voices in her head. You know those voices? The ones that say, why don't you start tomorrow? Tomorrow's a better day. Today's a good day to suffer. You're so much like your mother, you'll never change. What's wrong with me? Nobody loves me. And of course, my favorite one is, this doesn't feel right. Now, the moment we respond to those sub-vocalizations, that chatter, consciousness immerses itself right back into the program, and we return to thinking the same thoughts, performing the same metacognition. We can think about how we think. It's kind of unique. We can pay attention to how we feel. We can notice how we're acting and behaving. And because we can become conscious of those unconscious states, it means that we can modify our behaviors to do a better job in life. And that's called neuroplasticity, that the brain can actually physically and chemically change. When you took a group of people that were expert prayers, and they took these 3 vials of DNA, and they set these 3 vials of DNA in intention. Intention is just getting clear on what you want. It's a cognitive process. It's a thought process. With all of your thought intention, we want you to see this DNA winding and unwinding, winding and unwinding, winding and unwinding. Practiced it over and over again for prayers, and they said, okay, what we want you to do now is we want you to move into an elevated mood. We want you to feel goodwill and joy. And we want you to feel loving kindness. And we want you to radiate this emotion out into the field and just keep doing it over and over again. And at the end of the experiment, they checked the DNA, and guess what happened? Nothing. An elevated emotion like love or compassion did nothing to move into an elevated emotion of how you would feel if the DNA unwound. Give thanks, you think, are the electrical charge in the quantum field. And the feelings that you emote are the magnetic charge in the quantum field. And how you think and the feeling draws the event back. Now, what are you broadcasting every day? Because what you are broadcasting, you are asking the quantum field to manifest in a way that you would least expect, that surprises you. So if you're walking around in a state of guilt or suffering, you are basically saying, okay, quantum field, make it different. And leave no doubt that it came from you so that I'm inspired to keep doing this. So then, karma. We live the same lifetime every day. We're not punished for our sins, we're punished by our sins. Because as we stay in the same state of being, thinking and feeling in the same way, we keep creating the same experiences over and over again. Unmemorize the emotion, change your state of being, and the karma no longer exists. So what if you woke up in the morning and you said to your same thoughts and creating the same experiences that produce the same emotions, you said to yourself, let me remind myself of who I no longer want to be today. Let me become conscious of those unconscious thoughts that keep me returning back to the same self. I want to become so familiar with them that they would never slip by my awareness again. And what if you said, what behaviors do I identify? And what if you said, what emotions that I've memorized that's become part of my identity? That's not who I am. That's a record of the past. Let me begin to look at those emotions and how do they drive other emotions and other thoughts and other behaviors. And you began to become conscious and familiar of the old self, and you were so familiar with it, you'd never go unconscious again. And you made the decision with such a firm intention of who you no longer wanted to be, that the energy of the decision overrode the emotion of the addiction that kept you as the same identity. And then you said, how would a great person think? What did Nelson Mandela know that I don't know? What did Einstein, Tesla know that I don't know? What did Buddha think about? And as you begin to think in new ways, and you begin to contemplate new ways of being, and you begin to explore and speculate new behaviors, you begin to make your brain work in new and unusual ways. And as you begin to make your brain work differently, you're changing your mind. Now, what if you became so involved with what you were thinking about that the thought in your mind literally became the experience? That's the privilege of being a human being, is that we can make thought more real than anything else. And so as you begin to speculate a new way of being, and the thought becomes the experience, what's the end product of an experience? An emotion. Your body literally begins to believe that that future event is happening to you now, and you literally physically change your brain and emotionally signal new genes in your body, and you're moving into a new state of being. And what if you said, I'm not getting up until I am this person? You would say, well, how much time? A whole new electromagnetic signature. Now it's in fact a map to the future. And you living in that state of being says that I'm greater than my environment. I'm greater than the addictions of the old body. And I'm out of my old line of time. I'm living in a whole new reality. So we had a middle-aged man who was diagnosed with cancer. And he was on an elevator, and he was getting ready to go to work, and he was going up the elevator. And he was standing next to a dermatologist. The dermatologist leans over and looks at his face, and he says, hey, you know what? Step off the elevator with me. And the dermatologist takes this man off the elevator, and he sits on the beach, and he says, what emotion have I memorized that keeps signaling the same gene that's creating this disease? And he begins to observe himself in his life. And he has the realization that he had spent the last 25 years of his life living in resentment. He became so used to living in resentment that that just is who he thought he was. He never even paid attention to it because the feeling became so familiar. How many people are with me? So he takes out a piece of paper and he says, how do I think when I feel this way? And he writes down for the whole day every thought that was driven by that emotion. He closes his eyes and he memorizes the entire list, so much so he's got it completely committed to memory. Knows thyself. And as he becomes conscious of those unconscious programs at the end of the day, he surrenders it to the quantum field and asks it to resolve in a way that's perfect for him. Next day he goes out, he says, now, what emotions does this emotion drive? And he begins to write down impatience and judgment and prejudice and envy, and he writes all these emotions, begins defying his subjective mind. And at the end of the day, he surrenders those emotions. The next day he goes out, he does all three of them together again. He goes over the list over and over till he's got every single thought, every single behavior, every single emotion tapped out. Right around the fifth day, all of a sudden, guess what happens? He starts feeling really happy, seeing the same behaviors that create the same emotions. And his body is all of a sudden becoming freed from the chains of those emotional addictions. And as he begins to feel free, he's liberating energy. He's no longer contracted. The body's no longer living in the past. And when the body breaks free from the chains of those emotional addictions, the side effect is called joy, because the body is liberating energy. So now he's got all this available energy. He's broadcasting a whole new signature, and he feels so good, he starts to naturally think about how he's going to be when he returns back into his life. He starts thinking about how he's going to act, what thoughts he does want to put his energy behind. He begins to rehearse new ways of being, and he starts to begin to think about how those experiences would feel. And he starts signaling new genes in new ways. He does it every day for 5 days. He walks back into his life after do this again, but it was about the size of a lemon. And so on the day of that surgery to have that tumor removed, he was in the shower washing his hair, and he looks down, and the tumor fell off his new personality, new personal reality. Would you agree? The tumor existed in the old personality. He was somebody else. And he couldn't have that disease any longer because it was connected to the old emotion. His body was no longer living in the past, but now it was living in the future. How many people understand? So then as he began to emotionally feel differently, he began to literally turn on new genes that began to change his expression of self. And as he began to fire and wire new circuits, he was installing the new circuitry in his brain, the hardware, that he could use when he returned back into his life. His brain looked like the experience has already happened. His body was already emotionally being signaled as if the event was happening. He was already living in the future in the present moment. How many people are with me? That's what we do in our workshops. So then, we live in two states of mind. We either live in a state of survival or we live in a state of creation. Now, living in survival is living in stress. And stress is when your body's knocked out of homeostasis. Stress is when your body's knocked out of balance. The stress response is what your body innately does to return itself back to order. You with me? Now, you have three types of stress. You have physical stress, like trauma, accidents, injuries, falls. You have chemical stress, like flus and allergies and pesticides and pollutants and heavy metals and blood sugar levels and, that type of chemical imbalance, toxins. And then you have emotional stress. Traffic jams, internet connections, second mortgages, single parenting, 401ks, family tragedies. And your body is knocked out of balance in every single one of these things. You with me? Now, all organisms in nature are designed for short-term stress. Gazelle gets chased by a lion, and the gazelle outruns the lion. 15 minutes later, it goes back to grazing. In the body scenario, and to the exclusion of everything else, we can focus on it to such a degree that we make the thought so real that the body begins to physiologically change as if the event was happening. We knock the body out of balance, and the body, and boom, and like magic, it comes to life, and in that moment it's real, and the body begins to believe it's in that past event. Now, as we begin to turn on that stress response, we're turning on a very primitive nervous system called the fight or flight nervous system, or what's called the sympathetic nervous system. And when we have a sympathetic reaction or a fight or flight reaction for some threat in our environment, real or imagined, we mobilize all of this energy. And as we mobilize all of this energy, the body's prepared for an emergency situation. To somebody. In other words, the bad job, the terrible relationship, at least we can feel something. You know what I mean? Now, think about this. Those chemicals, by a scientific fact, the hormones of stress, over time, long-term stress response. In other words, when you turn on the stress response and you can't turn it off, now you're headed for disease. Because it's a scientific fact that the chemicals of stress long-term push the genetic buttons and downregulate or dysregulate genes that create disease. Now think about this. Well, you just said, you agreed with me that you understood that your thoughts Actually, you can turn on the stress response just by thinking about things, yes? And you also agreed that thoughts can make you sick because they can turn on the stress response. Is it possible that your thoughts make you well? So, those emotions that are created from the hormones of stress are these emotions: anger, aggression, hatred, prejudice, frustration, fear, anxiety, depression, hopelessness, insecurity, powerlessness. Those are all driven by the hormones of stress. And that's what psychology calls normal states of consciousness. Those are the altered states of consciousness. Self-centered, self-indulgent. He's concerned about my body. I got to take care of my body. Where in my environment am I going to go? And how much time do I have to get there? The body, the environment, and time. Now, when you and I live by the hormones of stress, we obsess about our bodies. You know what I mean? Hairstyles, what you look like, overweight, underweight. You obsess about things in your environment that you own or you don't own. We obsess about or become over-focused about time because those chemicals cause us to begin to function as materialists. And the self is something beyond the body in this environment and time. Now, the atom is 99.9999 with 13 zeros after it, percent nothing. It's empty space, it's energy, it's frequency. It's 0.0 with 12 zeros behind it with a 1 on the end, percent particle. And that particle only exists as a momentary phenomenon, and then it disappears. So you're moving in and out of the quantum field 7.8 times per second. And you're actually more energy than you are particle. Poke the person next to you. Don't they feel real? So now, when those hormones of stress are running, you and I as quantum observers are focusing on the particle and not on the potential. You with me? And so when you are in a creative state, you know what's so amazing? When you're living in the state of stress, you feel separate from possibility. Would you agree? And you're trying to force and control outcomes in your life. But when you're in a state of creation, something unusual happens. When you're truly creating, you forget about yourself. Don't you? You're so involved with what you're doing that you become nobody. You become no thing. You become no time. You become pure consciousness. And we have all the biological machinery to do this. Where your forebrain begins to control the hindbrain. It begins to quiet down the circuits in the rest of the brain that have to do with your body, the environment, and time. And you become pure consciousness. And the moment that happens, your brain captures the thought as the experience and begins to rewire the brain to look like the experience has already happened. And isn't it ironic that when we go from being selfish to being selfless, we lay down the ego and we become pure consciousness? Only when we are pure consciousness can we walk through the door to the quantum field. You can't enter as a somebody, you got to enter as a nobody. And isn't it ironic then that in order to have some type of control over your body, and we have to forget about time in order to have dominion over them? How many people are with me? Now, when you and I are in that elegant state of creation, we're no longer thinking and feeling and feeling and thinking in that same cycle, and we're no longer turning on these hormonal centers. And if you literally are no longer there, you are absent, you're pure consciousness, you forget about you, then you're no longer signaling these hormonal centers, and that energy begins to move somewhere, and guess where it moves? Right into your heart. Now, this is not a metaphysical concept. This is pure physiology. And when you begin to fall in love with your creation, you want the moment to last. And the moment that happens, you are literally signaling new genes in new ways, and your body's beginning to change. Now, most people wait for what? Crisis or trauma or disease or loss or diagnosis to really want to change. They wait to the point where the ego is brought to such a low level that they cannot go on business as usual any longer. That's when we begin to look at how we're thinking or what we believe or how we act or our attitude or what emotions we're living by. And my message is, why wait? We can learn and change in a state of pain and suffering, which tends to be the human model, or we can learn and change in a state of joy and that's it, making time for your precious self, waking up in the morning and beginning to think about a new possibility that exists in the quantum field. And as your brain begins to speculate new ways of being, the frontal lobe looks out over the landscape of the entire brain, and it begins to a new level of mind. And as it begins to do that, you are actually tuning in to a possibility that exists in the quantum field. Now, when is self-love born? When you're sitting down and your body is raging and it's trying to unseat you, telling you that you can't do it, or beginning to send signals back to your brain. And as it begins to do that, and you're sitting there, instead of giving into it, you say to your body, "That's all you got? That's your best? You know what? I'm going to wait till you're done. And then I'm going to recondition you to a new freedom." Right on the other side of your sadness is bliss. It's the same energy. It's just trapped in the body. And so when you're living in survival, feeling separate from possibility, focusing on the particle instead of possibility or the wave, and you're using your senses to define reality, we're materialists. But you feel liberated. You're focusing on the 99.9999% possibility. You're no longer the natural state of being. That's a natural state of being. That's the normal state of consciousness. And those stress hormones are the altered state of consciousness. And when you and I begin to change the things about ourselves that we don't like in the world, you know what I'm talking about, right? You can't say you want peace. We have to demonstrate all the changes we want to see in the world, to go from thinking to doing to being. Because you can get a group of meditators to focus on peace, and it'll absolutely lower crime rates in a community. It's a scientific fact. But when those people are done meditating and they leave the community, what happens? Returns right back to the ceiling level. It's not enough to just think it. We have to demonstrate it. And when you demonstrate greatness in any area, more particle to more wave, and you are taking waves of possibility and collapsing them into an event called an experience in your life. And I'm so happy to say that I'm not even here to convince you that it's possible. I already know it's possible. I mean, we just came from London this past, what's today? Wednesday? I got home on Monday, and we were teaching an advanced workshop there, and boy, there were so many miraculous things that happened to people. We had a lady that was exposed to a bacteria 15 years ago. And she was because anytime she traveled, of course, there was no food that she could eat. And then her blood sugar would go down and she'd be further out of balance. And she came to our advanced training in Colorado last month. And like magic, all of a sudden, she's eating anything she wants. Now, you think she's a happy person? I think that's the greatest compliment you could ever give me, is when people have some type of personal breakthrough and they're free now. They're no longer the same personality. Those states that keep us connected to those lower frequency emotions, that keep us focusing on particle or physical matter instead of possibility, living by those states over time signals the same gene in the same way. And that's what begins to create our genetic diseases. Is it possible then, as we begin to unmemorize that emotion and the body begins to become free, then you see possibilities that you never saw before because the filter of the emotion's been removed and you're no longer looking at your life from your past. You're seeing possibility again.
Wow. What an amazing show we just had. If you just tuned in, you're listening to the Gratitude provided by Dr. Joe Dispenza and what he's all about. And, of course, don't forget you can visit Dr. Joe Dispenza's website to hear more about his extensive workshops. Visit drjoedispenza.com. If you like the show, help more people find us by adding your review of the show on iTunes. The more reviews we get, the more people we can reach with this inspiring message on the Gratitude Café. Simply search for Gratitude Café in iTunes, hit subscribe, and add your honest review. It would help us immensely, and we'll be forever grateful. It's one of the best ways you can give back to the show with your review. Thanks for tuning in to the Gratitude Café. Don't forget, every week is a new show, and you could submit your questions at SueLundquist.com/Gratitude Café. The show goes live at 8 a.m. Pacific Standard Time in Seattle on Seattle's Alternative Talk AM 1150. You can also call in to the show at 425-373-5527 or 888-298-5569. Find the live streaming link at SueLundquist.com/Gratitude Café. We'll see you next week.
The views expressed on this program are those of the host, guests, and callers, and not necessarily those of KKNW, its management, or other advertisers. Contests are the responsibility of the host of this program and not KKNW. This is